Здравствуйте. Вы слышите меня? Прошу прощения, что я буду говорить по-английски, но так будет лаконичнее. Я очень рада быть на этой сцене этого зала. И спасибо за приглашение. So I shift to English. I will also be dealing with the notions of the classical and the contemporary, but without determining whether one is obsolete and out of date and another is, on the contrary, actual and up to date, but rather relying on its formal logic and hence trying to decipher the ethics of each. We all know that classical was some sort of obsession with our socialist aesthetics on the one hand. On the other hand, contemporary became the obsession of the post-socialist condition. So I will be trying to, in a way, research certain mutations in both of these paradigms. After 1989, in the capitalist West, as well as post-socialist East, there was an illusion that the worst is behind. Censorship of experimental artistic production, prosecution of underground avant-garde practices, banning of modernist and contemporary aesthetics, canonization of official provisions for culture. All these authoritarian forms of control seemed to be sublated, and even the absence of institutions could not be an obstacle to get integrated after the demise of the Soviet Union into the global institutional context of contemporary art. It seemed that only the Cold War and the totalitarian governments of socialism hampered culture to access the genuine processes of contemporaneity. However, at present, almost 30 years later, we see how many traps and pitfalls were contained in such naive optimism. The first failure was in that globality didn't occur to be universal or truly common. On the other hand, national sovereignties didn't guarantee equal priorities in the competition for global markets of economy, culture, art, and technology. Cold War of the bipolar world was over, but the confrontation of geopolitical alignments and competition for the economic, cultural, and techno-scientific domain became even harsher. In this situation, contemporary art, as the merit of both economic and global cultural visibility, became a sort of two-headed monster. On the one hand, it represented a duty for emancipation, even for the most remote and politically retarded regions. On the other hand, having acquired the form of global contemporaneity, art hijacked heritages of political and artistic emancipation and avant-garde and converted history of thought, of political struggle and art into global Esperanto, standing for enlightenment and emancipation in its formal narrative, but de facto functioning as supracurrency, as the cultural surplus of capital. So this double binding, the contemporary, on the one hand, it epitomizes emancipation. On the other hand, it is co-opting with financial capital. Meanwhile, what happened in post-socialist cultural politics represents the vicissitudes of primitive accumulation and adventures of its aftermath in building cultural superstructure. And we have these processes starting with the end of the Soviet, museification of conceptualist undergrounds, actionist activities, first private investments to establish new contemporary art institutions. All these gestures were socially and politically following the liberal democratic, counter-communist, left-liberal dissident aspirations and gradually occupying the marginal but still convertible wing of East European arts integration into the context of global art production. And this period is end of 80s and maybe mid 2000s. So in this multi-layered process between 1980s and late 2000s, the struggle for the so-called European values, liberated rights, seemed to be won by cultural intelligentsia, at least on the territories of contemporary art production, where art stood for all forms of emancipatory liberalization of the former totalitarian and traditionalist constraints. This process coincided with the gradual integration of post-authoritarian former socialisms into global post-socialist contemporaneity, where the subject of judgment nevertheless spoke from the West. And interestingly, such integration was again double-bind. It was conditioned by general neoliberal normalization, that is, with the catching up of the former socialist countries with the progressive neoliberal cultural production. But this neoliberal cultural production was definitely packaged in anti-neoliberal critical terminology. And exactly this very paradigm of contemporary art as the institute of global contemporaneity, started to degrade with the first financial crisis, with the failure of Occupy movements, with the crisis of secular autocracies in the Middle East, and supersession of the neoliberal democracies with anti-globalist, nationalist cultural politics on the territory of the former socialist space. And the climax for this process was the election of Donald Trump. Interestingly, the latter, the neo-national cultural projections that we all witness on the territory of former socialist space, started censuring the contemporary art practices that had already been evolving for 20 years, not simply because of the rise of the neocon ideology, as it is usually thought. No, the fight against contemporary that we witnessed in the last 5 years in the context of new clericalism was paradoxically not for traditional or religious and spiritual values in favor of classical art and its heritage. On the contrary, it evolved precisely in favor of what had to stand for the contemporary. So what is the reason for such paradox that the forces and the conservative institutes that represent something anti-contemporary want to take the charge of what has to be contemporary? The answer is actually simpler than it would seem. As we know, in former socialist countries as well as in Russia, private capital surpassed primitive accumulation and started to invest into post-socialist contemporary art much earlier than the state monopolist companies. So while state capital was dealing with political technologies, pop culture, cultural legacies, private capital prior to this was already investing in the contemporary practices. But why was the state blind to art before, and all of a sudden it became so much interested in it and took the grip of it and started monitoring it via security services? The reason of such sudden interest of state capital in contemporary practices is that in recent years, national art all over the post-socialist space got global convertibility. It became internationally valued and capitalized. It started to represent the local national in the packaging of global symbolic capitalized value. In short, it became a circulated global commodity and had to be nationalized by state monopolies. Yet, So now, in the last 5 years, we all are witnessing this nationalizing of contemporary practices, but not in favor of returning to traditional values, but rather in favor of erasing what used to be contemporary and selling what was not contemporary as the contemporary. But what is the problem here? The fight for nationalizing the contemporary was not simply about dumping the previous figurants in this field to simply occupy their positions and continue this practice after lustration. This was not possible because the process of the contemporary is a long-term epistemological process that started before and after 1968, and it was constructed by long edification of cognitive, institutional, social work, and this process unraveled itself via modernism, avant-garde, postmodernity, post-structuralism, ending up with the condition of the contemporary. It could have been simply hijacked. So what was taking place was, instead of simply occupying those positions and dumping the previous figurants, and doing the same, since doing the same is impossible because there is ignorance about what is the episteme of the contemporary, the new figurants are simply establishing whatever. They can sell whatever. Clerical values, orthodox values, fine art, 19th century realist art, but simply baptize and label it as their contemporary. This is actually the outcome when the proper edification for the contemporary is dismissed, because there is no time for this edification, and this act is ignoring and defying the already existing paradigm of contemporaneity and simply concocting the local national variant of how the contemporaneity will function on behalf of this quasi-Schmittian sovereign. The fight then is not for any return of genuine knowledge on traditions, as I said, but in getting the hegemony in trading the contemporary, at least in local national scale. Thus, as soon as in autocratic regimes oligarchic capital gets nationalized and governmentalized, it endeavors to insidiously get rid of all superstructures built previously by private capital. And the reason for this is that private capital in post-socialist countries got over primitive accumulation and started building superstructures much earlier than the governmental one. Governmental one was completely indulging in resource capital much longer than the private capital. That's why what we witness here, and not only here, but in Poland, in Croatia, in Hungary, is demolishing of the already constructed modes of contemporaneity, and instead of recurrence to certain reactionary or traditionalist institutions, we have relabeled and rebranded institutes of contemporaneity, something like hipster orthodox or whatever. But also the symptom of this is that governmental capital was always lagging behind cognitively the private capital. So Strelka is in a way partly private capital, partly state, but much more representing the private initiative. But as we see after the escalating, the counter-globalist rhetoric all over the post-socialist space, it was impossible to allow the already existing and integrated global institutes to function as they used to function in this context of contemporaneity. So this is this vicissitude of and fate of contemporaneity in this post-socialist space, and it might seem that these vicissitudes with contriving false contemporaneity are confined to societies that catch up with the global modernity after 1989, that otherwise contemporaneity is the realm of progress that saves from all forms of fundamentalist, reactionary, and coercive autocratic politics. That consequently contemporary art as the socio-cultural paradigm can function as certain universal invariant of progressive globalization. And as I said, contemporary has this mutation in itself of mutation between emancipation and capitalist coercion. So the power of art, on the one hand, makes any location or region in the third world convertible, affluent, liberated, up to date, but on the other hand, it simultaneously inscribes this very same place into global capital insofar as this location gets gentrified and acquires visibility for art markets and global cultural superstructures. So it is exactly this construction that collapsed with the conservative turn and Trump's elections. However, my statement is that the reason why such contortions and the reason why such mutations and such subversions are such perverted modes of representing contemporaneity are possible with the contemporary is the nature of the contemporary itself, which, as already mentioned, contains in itself relativity, ambiguity, which enables it to be flexible enough to cope with semio-capital and simultaneously package it as emancipation. Now let's leap back and ask, how did it happen that the dismissal of the classical in modernism and further in contemporary art was considered to be undoubtedly progressive, avant-garde, and revolutionary? It's a little bit a drastic leap back, but we know lots of theoreticians are criticizing contemporary art nowadays and the notion of contemporaneity from the left, and a lot has been written in the context of such critique by Frederick Jameson, by Peter Osborne, who is sitting here, by Suhail Malik, by Armina Vanessian. So the claim of the contemporary after Berlin Biennial, for instance, has been that we have to forget contemporaneity in favor of new futurologies, reanimation of meta-modernist, meta-avant-garde narratives to somehow surpass this total presence of global contemporaneity in favor of alternative futures. And what we see here, so we already achieved the issue and the idea that contemporaneity has to be criticized because of its mutated nature. On the other hand, what stays impeccable and certainly beyond any critique in its emancipatory pathos is modernism and avant-garde. But exactly to this, to the doubting of this impeccable character, I want to refer by means of the problem of the loss of the classical. What was important in modernism and avant-garde, that despite dismissing classical aesthetics, it contained the wound of the lost classical culture. It contained the trauma of these laws. And anywhere in modernist aesthetics or modernist, radical modernist pieces, Adorno, Weber, and Schomburg's writing, you deal with irrecoverable wound of the loss of the classical, and this trauma is evident elsewhere. On the contrary, in avant-garde, we see the total easiness of dispensing with the classical. Why? Because actually, what is the classical? Today we discuss the classical as some sort of rule, as some sort of canon, as some sort of eternal constraints or certain idea of harmony. Actually, if we return back to Hegel's aesthetics, the classical actually is the cycle of the idea. The classical enables to converge and conflate two things that has to be converged, not for the sake of art, not for the sake of aesthetics, but classical is necessary to exert the truth procedure. And what is necessary for the truth procedure by means of art and in art? It is not possible by means of idea, which would be possible in philosophy, but accessing truth by means of art, one can exert via sensuousness. So this is the main thing in the classical, convergence of cognitive and sensuous, of meta and idea. This most important notion of Hegel, which is Sinnlichkeit. Why were the socialist thinkers, starting with Lukács, Ilyenkov, Lifshitz, referring to this idea of classical? It was not because they were obsessed with certain eternal harmony of what art should comply with, but exactly with the issue that truth procedure is actually de-alienation, раз-отчуждение. Capitalist and bourgeois society exists in radical alienation. So what modernism does when it abstains from reality? It chooses alienation. It chooses cognitive as against real. It chooses speculative, abstract as against sensuous. So we have in modernism and avant-garde a radical split between meta and idea. And truth procedure in the classical was impossible without this convergence and without this idea of de-alienation. And why was for socialist aestheticians classical art the possibility and embodiment of potential communism? Because in classical art, this fantastic thing was happening. Truth and infinite and ideal issues were able to speak through objecthood, through sensuous. But it's not the issue of simple combination of meta and idea. What is extreme and what is really important in this necessity of pleroma, plenitude, of this convergence of the ideal and the real, of the cognitive and the of the sensuous, is actually, again, from something from which I started, the inevitability of idea to descend. And this is certain very important thing that Mikhail Lifshitz is emphasizing in the aesthetics of Hegel. As Lifshitz argues, sensuousness, Sinnlichkeit, is descent of spirit and of idea into reality, and of course it's a contradiction to idea. But this descent of the conceptual into the sensuous objecthood is an inevitable fate of the idea. Without descent into the sensuous, the idea is unable to express truth. So this was the main thing about classical, that without sensuousness, art will not speak the truth. So if modernism dispenses with the sensuous, it will not be speaking truth on the language of art. It will be speaking truth, as Kossuth said, on the language of philosophy or post-philosophy. And the idea of socialist aestheticians was that only by means of sensuous you can speak the true and exert the truth procedure. And I'm finishing here. So, convergence of the conceptual and the material is not simply balance between the extremes, the mind and body, but it is something heroic. It is the acceptance that this descent into the lowest, the most miserable, the most uncanny will happen. And what epitomizes this possibility and heroism of descent into the most unhappy, most oppressed for Hegel is Christ. It is the idea, the spirit that comes and dies in the most lowest and the most humiliated way. What is Dante doing? Dante is also descending the hell. So this is the classical artist which is endeavoring and has enough courage to be a martyr. So classical art is acceptance of martyrdom, and all classical personifications start and end with it. Even Orpheus, what is Orpheus doing? Orpheus is searching for Eurydice, and only descending into the Hades, he is becoming the singer. So this is again this idea of martyrdom, when the downshift into the sensuous from the highest is the sole move in the cycle of the idea. The lower is in its own turn. By the token of such sacrifice, the lower becomes able to be ideated and to access the ideal and get away from misery. Then the classical is rather about zeal and martyrdom destined to embody idea, and not at all about canon, rules, or prescriptions. It is exactly for this reason that communist aesthetics was relying on classical art, because it embodied certain crypto-communism and certain crypto possibility of de-alienation, despite and in the context of alienation. And the more so it would be the paradigm in the conditions of socialist political economy and communist project. The last but not least, then no surprise that the choice in socialist aesthetics was for the sake of classical, to dispense with modernism and contemporary art, those aesthetic paradigms that dispensed with Hegelian Sinnlichkeit and became the modes of capitalist abstraction and abstainment from reality, simply because communism does not need modernity or contemporaneity, simply because it is already an attained nova vita. And it is only natural that today, in the midst of totality of late capitalism, the struggle is and will be for the monopolization of the contemporaneity. Thanks.